They say your life flashes before your eyes when you're dying. Mine didn't. All I saw was the truth I'd been too blind to see. The headlights came out of nowhere that October night on Elmwood Street, where the colonial revival houses stood like silent witnesses to respectability. I remember the screech of brakes, the metallic taste of fear, and then the wet pavement beneath my cheek as my body crumpled like discarded paper. Blood pooled around me in the lamplight, warm against the cold autumn air. I was 23 years old, lying broken on the street I'd walked my entire life, and all I could think was that maybe, finally, they would care. The porch light of my parents' house flickered on. Through the blur of pain and fading consciousness, I saw my mother's silhouette glide past the lace curtains. I tried to call out, my voice barely a whisper. The curtains snapped shut with a finality that would haunt me for months to come. My father's voice carried through the closed window, sharp and contemptuous. I couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. Then my mother's cold laugh, that particular sound she made when dismissing something beneath her notice. Even Chloe, my 18-year-old sister, chimed in from her upstairs bedroom, her voice dripping with irritation about the disturbance. I lay there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching those curtains stay firmly closed. My family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, had looked out at my broken body and chosen to do nothing. That realization hurt more than any of my physical injuries. A delivery truck rumbled down the street around dawn. Mike, a middle-aged UPS driver with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard, spotted me on his morning route. I was barely conscious by then, hypothermic and going into shock. He called 911 immediately, stayed with me until the ambulance arrived, held my hand and told me I was going to be okay. A stranger showed me more compassion in those moments than my family had shown me in 23 years. At Maple Creek General Hospital, the doctors seemed surprised I'd survived. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, a severe concussion. The surgeon who pieced me back together said I was lucky, but luck felt like a cruel joke. The nurses tried calling my parents repeatedly. My mother answered once, her voice as cold as January frost. She said they were busy, that I wasn't their responsibility, that I'd probably staged the whole thing for attention. I heard every word from my hospital bed, and something inside me that had been bending for years finally snapped. That night, as machines beeped around me and pain medication dulled the worst of the physical agony, I made myself a promise. The version of me who had spent her entire life begging for their love, sacrificing herself for their approval, died on that pavement. The woman who would rise from those ashes would be someone entirely different. Physical therapy was excruciating. Learning to walk again, to move without wincing, to exist in a body that had been shattered and inexpertly reassembled. Every scar that formed on my skin was a reminder of the night they abandoned me. I traced them sometimes, these permanent marks, and let them fuel something cold and determined growing inside me. The hospital social worker helped me find a room above an old laundromat on the less affluent side of town. It wasn't much, just a single room with a hot plate and a bathroom I shared with 2 other tenants, but it was mine. No one there expected anything from me. No one there disappointed me. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything I could remember, everything I'd learned, everything I was beginning to see clearly for the first time. I'd always known my family wasn't perfect. My father, Richard, ran a commercial real estate business that seemed to operate in perpetual gray areas. My mother, Eleanor, was a fixture in local charity circles, the kind of woman who hosted fundraising luncheons and knew everyone worth knowing. Chloe was their golden child, destined for an Ivy League education and a brilliant future. And me? I'd been the family's workhorse, the one who handled the unglamorous tasks, who was called upon whenever they needed something but dismissed the moment I'd served my purpose. But I'd never truly grasped the depth of their disregard until I was lying broken in the street and they closed the curtains. After I could walk without a limp, I applied for a job at the Copper Kettle, a diner on Main Street that served as the town's unofficial gathering place. The owner, a grandmotherly woman named Ruth, hired me despite my lack of experience, touched by my story of recovering from an accident. What she didn't know was that I'd chosen her establishment very deliberately. The Copper Kettle was where everyone came for breakfast, for coffee, for the comfort of familiar faces, and the pleasure of familiar gossip. In a town like Maple Creek, population 15,000, everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. I quickly learned that if you wanted to understand the real workings of a community, you listened to what people said when they thought no one important was paying attention. I was very good at listening. My father came in every Tuesday morning with his business associates, holding court over scrambled eggs and black coffee. I heard about his questionable dealings, the corners he cut, the investors he'd smooth-talked into risky ventures. My mother lunched there every Thursday with her charity circle, and I learned that the generous philanthropist persona she cultivated publicly was a carefully constructed facade. She gossiped viciously about the same people she air-kissed at fundraisers, mocked their fashion choices and financial troubles with a cruelty that would have shocked her admirers. Chloe came in sometimes with her college friends, home on break, laughing too loudly and treating the waitstaff like servants. I learned that her prestigious scholarships weren't entirely merit-based, that my parents had made substantial donations to ensure her acceptance, that the academic awards she'd received were as much about networking as achievement. I never said anything directly. I didn't need to. I simply filed information away, and when the moment was right, I'd let slip small, carefully chosen details in conversations with the right people. A comment to the bank manager's wife about how my mother had laughed when someone less fortunate lost their home. A casual mention to a local reporter about the timing of my father's land deals and subsequent zoning changes. Tiny seeds planted in fertile soil, waiting for the right conditions to grow. One evening, Mike came into the copper kettle. He recognized me immediately, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing me recovered. We talked during my break, and he told me something I hadn't known. He'd tried to contact my parents that night, had called their house from the hospital to let them know what had happened. My father had told him I was prone to dramatics, that Mike shouldn't get involved in family matters, that they'd handle it. When Mike had persisted, Eleanor had gotten on the phone and accused him of harassment. Mike's hands shook as he told me this, his anger barely contained. He'd spent months feeling guilty, wondering if he should have done more. I assured him he'd saved my life, that he'd done everything right. What my family had done wasn't his fault, it was theirs. But his testimony, his willingness to share this story, became another piece of my carefully assembled puzzle. The first real crack in my family's perfect facade appeared at Chloe's graduation party. They'd rented out the Oakmont Country Club for the occasion, sparing no expense to celebrate their precious daughter's achievement. I knew about it, of course. The invitations had been printed on heavy cream cardstock with gold embossing. Everyone who mattered had received one. I had not. I stood outside the country club that June evening, watching through the tall windows as my family basked in admiration and congratulations. My mother wore a designer dress, my father an expensive suit. Chloe, radiant in white, accepted praise and gifts with practiced grace. They looked like the perfect American family, successful and loving and whole. I stayed for about an hour, just observing. I watched people notice my absence. I saw the whispers begin, the sideways glances at my parents, the questions forming. Where was their older daughter? Wasn't she the one who'd been in that terrible accident? Shouldn't she be here for her sister's big day? My parents' smiles grew strained as the evening progressed. They made excuses, vague statements about me being busy with work, being tired from my recovery, not feeling well. But Maple Creek was a small town, and people talked. They knew I was working at the Copper Kettle. They knew I was well enough to carry heavy trays and work double shifts. They knew something wasn't quite right with the story they were being fed. I left before the party ended, walked home through the warm summer night, and felt something like satisfaction settling in my chest. My absence had been more powerful than my presence ever could have been. The dominoes started falling faster after that. Mike, who'd been quietly furious about my family's behavior for months, reached his breaking point at a local bar called the Salty Dog. My father was there with his usual crowd, drinking expensive whiskey and boasting about a recent business deal. Someone made a joke about Richard's eldest daughter and her flair for drama. Mike slammed his beer glass down hard enough to crack it. The entire bar went silent as he stood up, facing my father directly. What he said next became the talk of the town for weeks. He described in vivid detail finding me bleeding on the pavement. He described calling my parents, their cold dismissal, their accusation that he was interfering. He described watching them close their curtains and leave their daughter to die. The silence that followed was deafening. My father tried to laugh it off, to spin it as a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. People remembered the seeds I'd planted in previous conversations. They started connecting dots they'd previously ignored. The charitable view of my family began to shift, like a photograph slowly developing to reveal a darker image beneath the pleasant surface. My mother called me 3 days later. Her voice, usually so controlled and imperious, shook slightly. She needed me to attend my father's award ceremony. He was receiving the Businessman of the Year award from the Chamber of Commerce, a prestigious honor he'd been working toward for years. The ceremony would be covered by local media. Important people would be there. Family was expected to attend. She didn't apologize for anything. She didn't ask how I was healing. She simply expected me to show up and play my part in maintaining their image. For a moment, just a moment, I felt the old urge to comply. 23 years of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. But then I remembered the curtains closing. I remembered lying in my own blood, calling for help that never came. I remembered every dismissal, every casual cruelty, every time I'd been made to feel like my worth was conditional on my usefulness to them. I told her I'd think about it, and hung up before she could respond. The ceremony was held at the Grandview Hotel, the nicest venue in Maple Creek, in a ballroom that usually hosted weddings and quinceañeras. I spent the week before deciding what to do, weighing my options, considering the consequences. Part of me wanted to simply not show up, to let my absence speak for itself again. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger since that night on Elmwood Street, wanted to face them directly. In the end, I decided to attend. I arrived 15 minutes after the ceremony started, after my father had already been called to the stage to accept his award. I dressed carefully in a simple navy dress that was elegant without being flashy. I wore my hair pulled back, makeup minimal, and I made sure my arms were bare, the scars from my accident visible to anyone who looked closely. The whispers started the moment I walked in. People recognized me, though I looked different than I had before. Stronger, more self-possessed. I wasn't the uncertain girl who'd tried so hard to please everyone. I was someone who'd survived being discarded and had chosen to stand on her own. My parents spotted me immediately. I watched relief flash across their faces, quickly followed by calculation. They moved toward me with practiced smiles, my mother reaching for my arm, my father preparing to pull me into the family tableau they wanted to present. The prodigal daughter returned to celebrate her father's success. I stepped back, just out of reach. The room quieted. People sensed something was about to happen, the way animals sense a coming storm. My father's smile froze. My mother's hand hung in the air between us. I looked at them, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time with completely clear eyes. Then I turned to face the crowd of Maple Creek's most influential citizens, the people my parents had spent decades cultivating, the audience for their carefully constructed performance. My voice when I spoke was calm and clear. I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. The room was silent enough to hear a pin drop. I asked them a simple question. I asked where they'd been the night I nearly died on Elmwood Street. My mother tried to interrupt, to explain, but I kept speaking. I asked if anyone in the room would close their curtains and leave their child bleeding on the street. I asked if they thought that was what loving families did. I didn't accuse. I didn't yell. I simply asked questions and let the answers hang in the air like smoke. The cameras that had been there to document my father's triumph captured everything. His face, drained of color. My mother's mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Chloe, standing near the back, looking like she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. Then I thanked Mike, who was standing near the door in his UPS uniform, having come straight from his shift. I thanked him for saving my life when my own family wouldn't. I thanked him for being the kind of person who stopped to help a stranger, who called for help, who cared whether I lived or died. After that, I left. I didn't storm out dramatically. I simply turned and walked away, leaving my parents standing in the wreckage of their reputation, surrounded by people who would never look at them the same way again. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks like a slow-motion avalanche. My father's business partners started distancing themselves, suddenly concerned about the ethics of their associations. Deals fell through, investors backed out. The questionable practices that had been overlooked when he was riding high suddenly became liabilities no one wanted to touch. My mother found herself uninvited from committees and fundraising boards. Her charity work, which had been her primary source of social status, dried up as people questioned the sincerity of her philanthropic efforts. The lunches at the Copper Kettle stopped. The phone calls went unanswered. The carefully cultivated friendships revealed themselves as the transactional relationships they'd always been. Chloe's scholarships were reviewed and quietly rescinded. Her acceptance to an Ivy League school was reconsidered. Her social media, once full of adoring comments, filled with questions and criticisms. The golden child discovered that gold leaf is easily tarnished. I watched it all from a distance, serving coffee and pie at the Copper Kettle, living in my small room above the laundromat, existing in a space they'd never bothered to see. People in town treated me differently now, with respect, with sympathy. Some apologized for not seeing what was happening. Others shared their own stories of family betrayal and difficult boundaries. Ruth gave me a raise and promoted me to assistant manager. She told me she'd always sensed I was stronger than I appeared, that survival often looked like surrender until the moment it didn't. 3 months after the award ceremony, my parents came to my apartment. I saw them from my window, climbing the narrow stairs beside the laundromat, looking older than I remembered. My father's shoulders stooped. My mother's designer clothes seemed to hang on her frame. They'd aged years in a few months, the consequence of stress and social exile. They knocked on my door. I recognized the rhythm, my father's particular pattern of 3 sharp raps. I stood on the other side, my hand on the doorknob, listening to them shuffle and whisper to each other. Deciding what to say, how to approach me, what strategy would work to fix what they'd broken. I opened the door. They looked shocked at the sight of me. I'd cut my hair short, let it curl naturally instead of fighting it straight. I'd gained healthy weight, muscle from physical work. My skin had color from walking instead of driving everywhere. I looked, I realized, like someone who'd been set free. My father spoke first, his voice uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. He said they were sorry. He said they'd made mistakes. He said family was important, that they needed to work together, that surely we could move past this unfortunate situation. My mother stood beside him, nodding, her face arranged in an expression of maternal concern that might have fooled me once. She reached for my hand, tried to step forward into my space, to establish the physical connection that would let her begin the process of manipulation she'd perfected over decades. I looked at them for a long moment. I saw them clearly, perhaps for the first time in my life. Not as the powerful figures they'd been in my childhood, not as the gatekeepers of love and approval I'd spent 23 years trying to please. Just as two people who'd made choices, who were now facing the consequences of those choices, and who wanted me to save them from discomfort. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the dramatic confrontation they might have been preparing for. I simply stepped back and closed the door. The sound of it clicking shut echoed in the stairwell. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, my father's protest beginning. I turned the deadbolt, that small mechanical sound so much louder than any words could have been. They knocked again. Called my name. My mother's voice rose in pitch, losing its careful control. My father's tone shifted from conciliatory to demanding. I sat on my bed, back against the wall, and listened to them try every approach they knew. Guilt, anger, bargaining, finally, pleading. Eventually, they left. I sat in my small room as the afternoon light faded, feeling something settle inside me that had been restless my entire life. I'd spent 23 years seeking their approval, believing that if I just tried harder, sacrificed more, proved my worth sufficiently, they would finally love me the way I needed to be loved. That night on Elmwood Street had shown me the truth. Their love was conditional, transactional, and ultimately not worth the price they demanded. Closing that door was the easiest thing I'd ever done. The weeks turned into months. Fall arrived, then winter. The town's attention moved on to other scandals, other stories, though my family never quite recovered their former status. They existed now on the periphery of Maple Creek society, tolerated but no longer celebrated. Their fall from grace, a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. I kept working at the Copper Kettle, saved my money, enrolled in online business courses. Ruth, seeing my aptitude and drive, began training me to eventually take over the diner when she retired. It wasn't a glamorous future, but it was mine, built on my own effort, dependent on my own choices, free from the weight of expectations I could never meet. Sometimes, I saw members of my family around town. Chloe at the grocery store, looking sullen and diminished. My mother at the post office, her designer bags replaced with department store alternatives. My father pumping gas into a sedan instead of his former luxury car. We never spoke. Our eyes would meet briefly, and then we'd look away. Strangers who happened to share DNA. I felt no triumph in their downfall, no satisfaction in their reduced circumstances. What I felt was something quieter and more profound. Relief. Relief that I no longer had to try to earn love from people incapable of giving it. Relief that their opinion of me no longer defined my worth. Relief that the burden of their expectations had been lifted, leaving me free to discover who I actually was. Spring came again, bringing with it the anniversary of my accident. I walked down Elmwood Street on a warm April morning, past the houses with their perfect lawns and closed curtains. I walked past the spot where I'd lain broken and alone, where everything I'd believed about my family had shattered along with my bones. The street looked different in daylight. Ordinary and unremarkable. No trace remained of that October night. The pavement had long since been washed clean. The world had moved on, as it always does, leaving the past behind like autumn leaves swept into gutters. I stopped at the exact spot, stood there feeling the morning sun on my face, and realized something important. I'd spent so long focused on what my family had taken from me, the love and support they'd withheld, that I'd almost missed what I'd gained. Strength, clarity. The ability to stand alone without crumbling. The knowledge that I could survive the worst thing I'd ever experienced and come out the other side not just intact, but better. They'd wanted me to disappear that night. In a way, I had. The version of me who'd needed their approval, who'd twisted herself into shapes trying to fit their expectations, who'd accepted crumbs and called it love, that person was gone. Dead and buried, like they'd intended. But I hadn't disappeared. I'd transformed. I'd become someone who knew her own worth, who understood that real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself, who could walk away from toxicity even when it wore the face of family. I continued down Elmwood Street, past my childhood home with its curtains drawn against the morning light. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. There was nothing there for me anymore, nothing worth the price of staying. Ahead of me, the street opened onto Main, where the Copper Kettle waited, where Ruth would be starting the morning coffee, where regular customers would be settling into their favorite booths, where I had work to do, money to earn, a future to build. A small future maybe, nothing like the grand destiny my parents had envisioned for their daughters, but it was honest. It was mine. And most importantly, it was built on a foundation that couldn't be shaken by anyone else's rejection or approval. The sun rose higher as I walked, warming the spring air, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because my family had suffered, not because I'd gotten revenge in any traditional sense, but because I'd done something much more powerful. I'd survived them. I'd survived their worst, their cruelty and indifference, and I'd come through it as someone stronger. Someone who could close a door on everything that hurt her and walk forward without looking back. That was the real victory. Not making them pay, but refusing to pay their price any longer. Not destroying them, but building something they couldn't touch. Not hating them, but simply not needing them anymore. I reached Main Street and turned toward the diner, ready for another day of the life I was creating for myself, one decision at a time. Behind me, Elmwood Street receded into memory, just another road in just another town. I'd walked it before as a daughter desperate for love. I walked away from it now as a woman who'd learned to love herself, and that made all the difference.